I joked that my roommate was practically my wife. She looked at me and asked what's stopping us. The joke left my mouth on a Wednesday night in March, standing in our kitchen at 11:30, and the moment it did, I knew it wasn't entirely a joke. She was sitting on the counter. She always sat on the counter, which had driven me insane for the first 3 months, and now I couldn't imagine the kitchen without it. Eating cereal because we'd both forgotten to cook, and I was making tea because I'd given up on sleep. And I said it the way you say things you've been quietly rehearsing without admitting that's what you've been doing. At this point, you're practically my wife. I laughed. It was supposed to land like the dozens of other half-jokes we'd traded for 2 years. She looked up from her bowl, and for one long second she didn't say anything, and then she tilted her head and said, very calmly, "What's stopping us?" I didn't have an answer. That was the part I hadn't rehearsed. Her name was Simone, and we had moved into the apartment together 26 months before that kitchen moment, through the most unromantic mechanism 2 people can share: a Craigslist post and a mutual desperation to afford a 2-bedroom within commuting distance of downtown. She was the 3rd person I interviewed. She brought her own tape measure to check the closet dimensions. I noticed this and said nothing about it, because I didn't know yet that it was going to tell me everything about who she was. I showed her the apartment. She measured 3 things, asked 4 practical questions about the water pressure and the building's laundry situation, and whether the upstairs neighbors had ever been a noise problem. And then she said she'd take it. I said great. She said she could sign Friday. I said Friday worked. That was the entire beginning of the thing. What you don't understand when you move in with a stranger who becomes a roommate, who becomes a friend, is that the transformation doesn't happen in any dramatic, traceable moment. There is no conversation you can point to, no trip or crisis that forged the connection on purpose. It happens in the unremarkable moments, the ones you don't archive, because at the time they don't seem worth archiving. It's learning that she takes her coffee with oat milk, not because she's particular about it, but because dairy genuinely makes her sick. And she never mentions this when you're out together, because she doesn't want to be the person who complicates the order. It's knowing which drawer she keeps the scissors in, because she reorganized the kitchen once while I was at work and left me a note, not a text, an actual handwritten note on the counter, so I wouldn't spend 20 minutes confused. It's the particular sound of her laugh when something surprises her, which is different from the laugh she produces when something is funny, but expected. It's 2 years of accumulated Tuesdays and Wednesdays and unremarkable Thursday evenings that add up to a person you know the way you know very few people in your adult life, without having decided to know them that deeply. It happened through proximity and repetition and a shared lease, and the fact that we were both, it turned out, the kind of people who leave the kitchen light on for whoever gets home last. She worked in urban planning. She spent her days thinking about how physical space affects human behavior, how the layout of a neighborhood determines whether strangers become neighbors or remain strangers who happen to live near each other, how the distance between things shapes whether people connect or drift past each other without touching. I thought about this a lot. Later, when I was trying to understand how 2 people could share 4 rooms for 2 years and end up where we ended up. There's something that wants to make it fate, or chemistry, or whatever word you use when you need an explanation. The honest answer is probably simpler than that. We occupied the same space. We were paying attention. Space plus attention, given enough time, produces intimacy whether you invited it or not. Knowing someone and being willing to admit what that knowing means are 2 different distances, though. The first one we covered in about 6 months. The second one took longer. The thing I didn't know for the first 8 months was that Simone was carrying something she hadn't told me about. I'd noticed the signs the way you notice things when you're paying attention to someone without realizing that's what you're doing. She got quieter in November. Not sad, exactly. More like someone who was managing a specific expenditure of energy and didn't have extra. Her phone calls started happening in her room with the door closed. Twice, she came back from a weekend visiting family, looking like someone who had driven 4 hours each way and come home emptier than when she'd left. I didn't ask. She hadn't offered. And asking felt like crossing a line I wasn't sure I had the right to cross just because I lived on the other side of a wall from her. The line moved the night she knocked on my bedroom door at 12:15 and said, "I need to tell you something, and I don't want to make it weird." I put down what I was reading and said, "Tell me." She sat on the floor, cross-legged, which she does when something is serious. She told me about Marcus. Not all of it at once. The full picture took weeks to assemble, but the outline of it. They had been together for 2 years before she and I had met. The relationship had ended badly, which in this case meant it had ended with him deciding it was over, and her discovering, several months later, that he had not entirely decided this. He had moved the relationship to somewhere he could access it privately, while denying its existence publicly. She had found out, and she had closed that door firmly, and she had moved, partly to put distance between herself and the geography of the whole thing. He had spent the 8 months since her move in slowly, persistently, trying to push the door back open. Texts that began as friendly and gradually shifted into something she described as testing the temperature. Phone calls spaced at careful intervals, so they never quite constituted pressure, but always constituted presence. Every time she didn't respond, he waited, and then he tried again. Every time she responded briefly, he treated it as evidence that the door wasn't fully closed. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. She looked at the floor for a moment. "Because telling you would make it a real problem, and I was still deciding if I needed it to be a real problem, or whether I could manage it quietly until it stopped on its own." She paused. "And because I didn't want you to think I was bringing something messy into the apartment." I looked at her sitting on my bedroom floor and thought about the 8 months of closed doors and careful phone calls and the particular hollowness she sometimes came home with, and I said, "Simone, you could bring an entire disaster in here and it would still be fine." She looked up. Something shifted in her face. "Tell me when it gets worse," I said. "Not when it's an emergency. When it gets worse," she nodded. And then she went back to her room, and I lay in the dark, and I thought about the man who had been texting her for 8 months without her mentioning it, and I felt something I recognized as anger but didn't examine too closely, because examining it would have told me more than I was ready to know at 12:30 on a Tuesday night. Over the next month, I paid attention differently, not visibly. I didn't ask her about it. Didn't push, but differently. I noticed that the texts from Marcus arrived in clusters, 3 or 4 across a weekend, then silence for a week, then 2 in a single evening. The silence was engineered to make the contact feel casual rather than relentless, coincidental rather than intentional. She had told me enough that I could read the pattern even when I wasn't seeing the messages themselves. What I was seeing was her, absorbing them. The way she'd be fine at dinner and then check her phone and become slightly less present in a way that lasted maybe 20 minutes before she pulled herself back. The way she'd sometimes be already tired when she got home. Not from the job, but from something she'd been managing on the way there or back. She was spending real energy on this. The kind of energy you don't notice you're spending until someone points to the thing it was going toward. I didn't point. I kept the kitchen light on, and I made extra when I cooked, and I let her sit on the counter and eat cereal at 11:30, and I watched and waited. Then the second thing happened. This is the one that changed it from a weight she was carrying to actual danger. She came home on a Thursday evening with her jaw set in a specific way I had learned to read as, I have news, and I've been holding it for hours, and I have no more room for it. She put her bag on the couch and said, "He called my office." I stopped what I was doing. "He called my office," she said again, quieter, like she was still working out what it meant. "He spoke to my assistant. He said he was an old friend, that my cell wasn't going through, and she gave him my direct line and told him I had an opening Thursday afternoon next week." I set down what I was holding and turned to face her. "He knows your schedule now," I said. My assistant thought she was being helpful. "Does HR know that an external caller just obtained your calendar from a colleague who didn't know not to give it?" She looked at me. I hadn't framed it that way. "Simone, what he did today has a specific name in a workplace policy context. He made a false representation to gain access to your professional information. Your company almost certainly has a process for this." She sat on the couch. "If I go to HR, it becomes official. A record. People know there's a situation. There is a situation. It became a situation 8 months ago. The only question now is whether you control the documentation of it or he does." I sat down across from her. "You went to HR, they make a file. He escalates, you have a file. You have nothing, he escalates, you have nothing." She sat with that for a long moment. Then she said, "Will you come with me? Not in the meeting, just to the building." Yes, obviously. The next morning she went to HR. I sat in the lobby on a bench near the elevators with my phone and a bad cup of coffee from the cart outside, and she was in the meeting for 50 minutes. When she came through the door, she looked lighter than she had in months. Not happy exactly, but lighter. The specific lightness of someone who has stopped carrying something alone. She walked to me and said, "They flagged it. They're issuing a formal no-contact instruction through legal channels. Building security has his photo and name." She exhaled. "It's real now." "Good. It feels strange to say good about this. You held this by yourself for 8 months. Saying good about getting help seems reasonable." She almost smiled. We went for coffee down the street. Real coffee. And she told me about the meeting. The HR officer who had been calm and efficient and not at all dramatic about it. The way being taken seriously by an institution feels different from being believed by a single person, even a person you trust. She said, "I kept waiting for her to ask me what I'd done to cause it." She never asked. "You didn't cause it, I know. But I've been operating as if I have to preemptively prove that. Every time I tell anyone." She looked at her cup. "I didn't do that with you." "No, why not?" I thought about it. "Because you knocked on my door at midnight, and the first thing you said was, 'I don't want to make it weird.' You weren't building a case. You were just telling me." She looked at me across the coffee shop table with an expression I filed away, without knowing why. 4 days after the HR meeting, Marcus sent a text to her personal number. It said, "I just want to understand what I did." She showed it to me across the kitchen table without saying anything first. Just slid the phone across the wood like a piece of evidence. "He's framing himself as confused," I said, "like this is something that happened to him. That's what he always did." Her voice was even. Whenever there was a problem, by the end of the conversation I was always explaining myself, and he was always the one trying to understand. I never noticed until I was outside of it. She turned the phone face down. "I'm not going to respond." "Good. I keep feeling like I should, though, like not responding is cruel." "He created a personnel file at your workplace. Not responding to his text isn't the cruelty in this situation." She looked at me steadily. "You have a very efficient way of cutting through things. Does it help?" Enormously, a pause, which is interesting because I'm usually the person people come to for that. I'm usually the one being efficient about other people's situations. Maybe it's easier when it's not your situation. Maybe. She picked up her phone and put it in her pocket. Or maybe you just know how to say the thing I'm already thinking in a way I can actually hear it. I didn't answer that. I should have. I chose not to. 3 weeks passed. No texts, no calls. The formal instruction had done what it was supposed to do, and the silence it produced was clean in a way the previous silences hadn't been. The apartment settled back into its normal rhythms. Gerald the succulent appeared on the windowsill. She bought it on a Saturday at the farmer's market without any particular announcement, just set it there and started watering it. And I said nothing, because it seemed to make her happy in a small, undemonstrative way, and I had no objections to small, undemonstrative happiness in our apartment. We named it one evening when we were both tired, and the naming devolved into 30 minutes of increasingly unreasonable suggestions before we landed on Gerald. A name that suited him in ways neither of us could quite articulate. Then the fourth thing happened, and this one arrived sideways. Simone had a former colleague named Devon. They'd worked together for 3 years at a previous firm before she moved to her current position. They stayed in the easy contact that former good colleagues maintain. Occasional check-ins. Lunch a couple of times a year. Genuine warmth without the regular proximity to maintain it at full volume. Devon also knew Marcus. Distantly. They had overlapped at a work event 2 years back, had maybe 3 mutual professional connections between them. The kind of thin social graph thread that a city produces by accident. On a Tuesday in April, Simone got a message from Devon that she read 3 times at the kitchen counter before she held the phone out to me without a word. I read it. Devon had written, "Hey, strange thing to bring up, and honestly tell me if this isn't my place, but Marcus reached out to me last week. He wasn't dramatic about it, just asked how you were, whether you seemed happy, whether you were seeing anyone, whether you still lived at the same address as before." I told him I hadn't seen you in a few months and gave him nothing specific. But it felt off, and I thought you should know. You seem like you're doing well, and I didn't want anything messing with that. Sorry if this is weird to receive. I read it once more and looked up. "He's mapping me," she said. "He can't reach me directly, so he's going around. He's asking people who are connected to me to fill in the gaps. Yes, that's not someone trying to reconnect. That's someone doing reconnaissance." Yes. I handed her phone back. The no contact instruction covers direct contact with you and direct contact with your workplace. It may not cover third-party inquiries. Do you have a copy of the exact language? She had a copy. We spread it on the kitchen table and read it together, slowly, the way you read something when the specific words matter. The instruction covered direct contact with Simone by any medium and direct contact with anyone at her current employer. It did not, in the version she'd been given, address contact through third parties or information gathering through people outside the workplace. Marcus had read this document. Or had someone read it for him, and he had stepped to exactly the edge of its coverage, and stopped there. "He knows where the line is," she said. He lawyered the line. "Yes," she sat back. "So it's not a violation, not technically. But it is a documented pattern, and you now have a witness who can describe what he asked and when." I paused. Get Devon to write it down, even just a short paragraph. What he said. What questions he asked. What Devon told him. Written, dated, sent to you in a message you can save. She looked at me. "You think this goes further?" "I think a man who has already made a false representation to your workplace assistant and is now triangulating your address and relationship status through former colleagues is managing something. And what he's managing is access to you. Whether it goes further depends on him. But you want the documentation to already exist when it does. She reached out to Devin that night. Devin wrote back within 40 minutes with a clear and specific account, the platform Marcus had used to contact him, the exact questions he'd asked, the date of the conversation, what Devin had and hadn't disclosed, organized, usable, the kind of documentation that makes a legal argument coherent instead of impressionistic. She had it saved and printed before the week was out. Then she built the timeline. This took 3 evenings at the kitchen table. She made a document, a real one, deaded entries, factual and dry as a court record, logging every instance of contact Marcus had made since the original HR instruction, the text about wanting to understand what he'd done, the contact with Devin, the dates and platforms and what each exchange had contained. She was meticulous about it in a way that I found both impressive and quietly heartbreaking, because this kind of meticulousness is what happens when someone has learned, from experience, that their account of events will be questioned. She wasn't building a story. She was building something no one could argue with. I sat at the other end of the table those evenings, doing my own work, both of us quiet and focused, the kitchen lamp warm between us. She didn't ask for help with the document, and I didn't offer it, because it wasn't mine to do. But once, when she paused and looked at what she'd written with the expression of someone who can't believe they've had to write it, I said, without looking up from my own screen, "It's good. It's exactly what it needs to be." She was quiet for a moment, and then she went back to typing. This is not a romantic story in the way movies mean that word. There were no grand gestures, no rain, no one running through an airport. What there was those 3 evenings was a kitchen table and 2 people who had figured out, somewhere in the previous 26 months, how to be present for each other without making it a performance. That is what she needed, and it was what I had, and that is as close to right as any 2 people are likely to get. The second HR meeting was on a Friday morning, 9 days later. The folder went with her, the Devin message, Devin's written account, the timeline she'd assembled, the original instruction and all its language. I went to the building with her again. Same bench, worse coffee than last time, which was an achievement. She was inside for 70 minutes. When she came out, she walked to me and stood there for a second before she said anything. They're expanding the instruction, and their legal team is getting involved directly, which means it's no longer an internal HR matter. It's correspondence from a law firm. Good. He's going to receive it Monday. Good. I keep waiting to feel like I went too far. You documented what happened and gave it to the appropriate people. He did the things that are documented. She exhaled slowly. He's going to be angry. He may be. That won't be your fault either. She looked at me on that lobby bench with the same expression she'd had in the coffee shop weeks before, and this time I didn't look away from it, and neither did she. And then she said, "Come on. I promised you lunch the last time, and we never did it. We went to the Italian place around the corner that we'd been mentioning for 8 months and never actually entered. We stayed for nearly 2 hours. We didn't talk about Marcus once." She told me about a neighborhood revitalization project she was working on, an underinvested corridor on the east side of the city that she'd been trying to get her firm to take seriously for a year. And they'd finally approved the preliminary assessment, and she talked about it with the particular animated focus of someone who'd been holding a good thing in reserve and was finally allowed to be excited about it. I told her about a project at my own job that had been grinding for months and had just broken loose in the right direction. We talked about whether Gerald needed a companion plant and what the companion's name would be, and whether 2 plants constituted a collection or just 2 plants. We talked about a film she'd seen and I hadn't, and she described the ending scene in enough detail that I felt like I'd seen it. The food was excellent. The wine was 1 glass each because it was a Friday afternoon. When we left, she tucked her hand into the crook of my arm as we walked back toward the subway stop. Not romantically, just in the easy proprietary way of someone who is comfortable with where they are and who they're with, and I registered this carefully and set it in the same internal file where I kept all the other things I wasn't ready to label. Marcus received the legal letter on Monday. We knew this because his attorney sent a formal acknowledgement. We knew he had an attorney because Simone's company's legal team notified her, which is how she learned that the man who had sent her a text about wanting to understand what he'd done had simultaneously hired someone to manage his legal exposure. She came home Monday evening and put this information on the kitchen counter between us like an object that she wanted a second pair of eyes on. "He has a lawyer," she said. "That means the instruction landed. That means he knew he'd done enough to need one. Also that." I looked at her. "How are you?" She thought about it honestly. Strangely calm. I thought finding out he lawyered up would make it feel more serious and therefore scarier. It doesn't. It makes it feel more defined. Like both sides of this thing now have a shape. You're not alone on your side of it anymore. She was quiet for a moment. "No, I'm not." She looked at me steadily. "I haven't been for a while." The weeks that followed were quieter than any stretch in the previous 9 months. No texts. No calls to her office. No messages routed around the perimeter through people who knew her. The silence was structurally different from the silences Marcus had used before, which had been held breaths, deliberate, strategic, designed to create space he could fill again later. This silence was an absence. Simone knew the difference immediately, and I could watch her knowing it. The way you can watch someone's shoulders drop when they've been holding them up for so long, they forgot they were doing it. She started cooking again. She'd gotten out of the habit during the worst of it, defaulting to take-out containers and quick things. And somewhere in April, she came home on a Tuesday with groceries and made a real dinner and set 2 places at the kitchen table without asking. Because she didn't have to ask. Because we'd been eating together most evenings for 2 years, and the question of whether I wanted dinner had not been a real question for a long time. We ate and talked and cleaned up together, and she watered Gerald, and I turned off the kitchen light, and that was Tuesday. Then a Saturday she came back from a run and showered and announced she was going to the farmer's market, and did I want to come. She had never asked me to the farmer's market before. We had mentioned it to each other as a thing that existed nearby and that reasonable adults attended, but we'd never actually gone together. Which in retrospect is the kind of small social gap that seems inexplicable until you remember that it had always been slightly too much like a thing couples do, and for 2 years we had been very careful, without discussing it, not to do too many things couples do. That Saturday we went. We were there for 90 minutes. She bought dried lavender and a jar of local honey and stood for a long time at a stall selling handmade ceramic mugs, turning one over in her hands, before deciding against it and then going back for it. I bought tomatoes and some bread. We walked home. It was a normal Saturday in every external particular, and something shifted in it that I couldn't have described at the time, but couldn't miss either. The weeks after that had a quality of arrival to them. Like something that had been in transit for a long time had quietly reached its destination and was waiting to be unpacked. I noticed things I had been noticing for 2 years but differently now, or maybe just more honestly. The way she moved around the kitchen with a complete physical comfort that had taken us about 4 months to establish and had been so reliable since that I'd stopped clocking it as notable. The way she remembered things, not extraordinary things, not the birthdays and anniversaries that everyone knows to track, but the small things. The things you only remember if you were paying attention in the ordinary moment when they were mentioned. She remembered that my sister's presentation was on a Thursday and asked about it on Thursday evening. She remembered that I didn't like the brand of sparkling water our usual grocery stocked and had switched to a different one without mentioning it. She moved through the apartment with a steady, unannounced awareness of the person she lived with. I had been the beneficiary of this for 2 years without naming it. I was naming it now. Late, but accurately. Wednesday came, cereal and tea in the kitchen at 11:30, and the joke I'd been pretending was only a joke. At this point, you're practically my wife. She looked up. The bowl was still in her hand. 1 second, 2 seconds, and then the head tilt. And the calm and, what's stopping us? I set the mug down on the counter. I could have laughed it off. I could have said something easy that let us both pretend the question was rhetorical. I could have chosen the comfortable shape of what we already had over the uncertain shape of what we were standing at the edge of. 2 years of careful, habitual, comfortable friendship is not nothing. It is, in fact, quite a lot. Losing it is a real risk. I knew this. I said, nothing. Absolutely nothing. She held my gaze for a moment that contained the entire 26-month history of the apartment, the tape measure and the Craigslist post, and the midnight knock on my bedroom door, and the lobby bench, and the Italian restaurant, and every ordinary Tuesday that had added up, without our permission, into something that was not ordinary at all. Then she set the cereal bowl down on the counter behind her and said, "Okay," in the voice of someone completing a task they've been working on for a while. It was the least dramatic moment imaginable, which made it the most accurate representation of what it actually was. She slid off the counter. 6 feet of kitchen between us. A kitchen we had occupied together for over 2 years. A kitchen we both knew better than we knew most things. She crossed it. We did not make announcements. We did not renegotiate the lease or have a formal conversation about what to call the thing. The next morning was Thursday. She made coffee with oat milk and poured a second cup before I asked, because she'd known I'd want one since roughly month 4. I noticed, consciously for the first time, that this was an act of love, not a large one. The accumulated small ones are the ones that mean the most, because they happen every day, because they happen without being asked, because they require someone to have been paying enough attention to know. I've thought a lot, since then, about what she said during the worst of the Marcus situation. We were sitting on the living room floor one evening, her back against the couch, and she said, "He needed me uncertain." Someone who doesn't trust their own judgment will accept things they shouldn't, because accepting is easier than deciding. He cultivated that in me deliberately, not with cruelty, with patience. He was very patient about making me doubt myself. She had said it about Marcus, and she had said it clearly and without self-pity, the way she says things she's thought through completely. But I had sat there and thought about uncertainty as a general condition, about how long I had been certain about her, and calling it uncertainty because certainty felt like too large a claim on someone else's life without their permission. I hadn't been waiting for more information. I had the information. I had had it for months. I'd been waiting for permission I could have just asked for, if I'd been willing to risk the asking. She asked first. I'm glad she did. It means she decided, without waiting to be invited, that the thing was real enough to name. That took more courage than my answer did. It also tells you something important about who she is. She is not a person who waits for the situation to become comfortable before she acts on what she knows. She acts and lets the comfort catch up. She did it with HR. She did it with Devin's account and the kitchen table timeline. She did it in the kitchen at 11:30 on a Wednesday in March, eating cereal on a counter, asking the real question instead of the hedged version of it. I think about the tape measure she brought to the apartment viewing. I think about it more than makes logical sense. She brought it because she needed accurate information before she committed. She measured the closets not because she had unreasonable expectations, but because making a decision without real data seemed to her like a preventable error. That is exactly what she did in our kitchen that night. She had the data. She had 2 years of it. She asked the question that the data pointed toward. This is who she is all the way through, and I did not see it clearly until I was on the right side of the answer. We are still in the same apartment. The lease renewed in June, both names on it as it always has been, which is technically the same document and functionally a different one. Gerald the succulent is still on the windowsill and has developed 2 offshoots we have not yet named. She still sits on the counter, and I have genuinely stopped minding. I make tea too late at night, and she takes the last of it without asking, because she knows I'll make more, which I will, which she knows. The kitchen light stays on for whoever gets home last, because it always has. Last week I was standing at the stove attempting a soup that had no real recipe behind it, just ambition and a partial memory of a technique she'd mentioned once, and she came home and stood in the doorway for a moment watching me and then said, "You have absolutely no idea what you're doing." "Correct," I said. She hung up her coat, came and stood next to me, turned the heat down by a third, added 2 things from jars I hadn't touched, and said, "Give it 10 minutes. 10 minutes later, it was excellent." She didn't say anything about this because she didn't need to. I thanked her. She said, "You would have gotten there. I probably wouldn't have." But that's what she said, and I've been thinking about it since, because it's a very specific thing to say to someone. Not "you were close" or "with a few adjustments." "You would have gotten there." It is the thing you say to someone when you have decided, on their behalf, that they are capable, not provisionally, not with caveats, but as a settled matter of fact. It is the most generous form of belief. It is, I think, what she has been offering me since long before the kitchen on a Wednesday night in March. I am working every day on being worth that particular generosity. It is the most worthwhile work I have ever done, and it started in a kitchen at 11:30 with a joke I'd been meaning to say for longer than I admitted. Have you ever looked at the person across from you in the middle of some perfectly ordinary moment? A kitchen, a couch, a Tuesday evening that doesn't have any reason to matter, and realized you'd been calling it something safe and practical, because naming what it actually was would mean you had to do something about it? Who is the person in your life you have been describing to everyone as your roommate, your friend, your colleague, when the honest word has been sitting right there, and all that was stopping you from using it was that it was true? If this story found you at the right moment, subscribe. There is another one waiting.